Meeting is in order. Bon matin and welcome
Good morning.
to the third meeting of the Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs. This meeting is being televised. We're pleased to be joined today by the Honourable Karina Gold, Minister of Democratic Institution, who is here to provide a briefing on the creation of an independent debates commission. You've been here many times, Minister. We appreciate your time. She's accompanied by Alan Sutherland from the Privy Council Office. He is the Assistant Secretary to Cabinet, Machinery of Government. Members will recall the committee did an extensive study on the matter and that our 55th report, which was presented to the House on March 19th, 2018. I will now turn the floor over to you, Minister, for your opening statement.
Great. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and to the committee for inviting me here today, and I'm delighted to appear before you with Al Sutherland from PCO. I appear before you today to discuss our government's commitment to establishing an independent debates commission. We all agree that leaders' debates provide Canadians the opportunity to compare and contrast party leaders' policies, positions, and characters. Canadians, whether they have limited accessibility, live in a rural or remote area, or are part of an official language minority community, have the right to access vital information about their choice of leader, party, or platform. Depuis les années 1980,
Since the 1980s, at least 2 debates in each official language have been organized during federal election campaigns. These debates are usually broadcast by large Canadian media outlets. We all know that the leaders' debates play a vital role in Canadian federal elections.
in 2015, this tradition was abandoned, resulting in a debate about the debates. When one party could not agree with the consortium of broadcasters, a signature English language debate was cancelled. Malheureusement,
Unfortunately, during the last elections, this process was basically taken hostage by the political parties and their partisan backers. Canadians paid the price. In-camera discussions and secret agreements created an environment and a climate that didn't make it possible to know whether a debate would be held and who would be debating. An independent commission in charge of a leaders' debate would ensure that Canada's interests and the interests of Canadians remain at the heart of the organization and broadcasting process.
were not provided with the opportunity to hear from those seeking to be the next Prime Minister, as the televised debates were not made accessible to all. With the creation of the Leaders' Debates Commission, we are ensuring that leaders' debates remain a predictable, reliable, and stable element of future election campaigns, produced in the interests of Canadians and not political parties. We did not come to this decision lightly. It was informed by a thorough consultation process that included online consultations with Canadians, a series of roundtables with over 60 specialists, broadcasters, academics, and stakeholders from across the country, and a study by this committee. Dans le cadre des consultations,
Within the framework of these consultations, 5 roundtables were organized and run together by my department and the Public Policy Research Institute. These roundtables were held in Halifax, Toronto, Winnipeg, Vancouver, and Montreal. Based on the discussions, recommendations were presented and included establishing an independent organization, an independent body in charge of supervising the leaders' debate during Canada's federal elections.
the creation of the Debates Commission was also informed by the report submitted by this committee. I want to thank each of you for your contribution to this study. And I am reminded that many on this committee supported the idea of an independent body to oversee federal debates. Ce rapport
The report, as well as our consultation process and our discussions held, have helped us draw up a special framework which is based on independence, impartiality, credibility, democratic citizenship, civic education, and inclusion. The message that Canadians gave us was very clear. The leaders' debate should be accessible to the largest possible number of Canadians and on a number of platforms. Moreover, it should be organized first and foremost in the interest of Canadians and not in a way that would advantage any particular party.
Of an independent Leaders' Debates Commission, which will be led by a commissioner and supported by a 7-member advisory board. The commissioner will be mandated to produce 2 signature debates, one in each official language. The production feed will be made available free of charge to those who wish to distribute it. Les intervenants nous ont...
Canadians also told us that this decision shouldn't be taken rapidly or rushed, and that it would be wise to allow for a process that would take into account lessons learned, rather than sticking to an inflexible structure.
Mandated to provide a report to Parliament outlining findings, lessons learned, and recommendations to inform the potential creation in statute of a built-to-last debates commission. Le très honorable David Johnston a été choisi.
The Most Honourable David Johnston is the government's nominee as first commissioner in charge of the Leaders' Debate.
General of Canada from 2010 to 2017 and has had an illustrious career. Among his especially notable academic credentials, he has served as principal of McGill University, Dean of Law at the University of Western, and President of the University of Waterloo. He has chaired commissions at the
Right Honourable David Johnston,
including the environment, learning, and broadband access. Il a également animé plusieurs débats des chefs.
Right Honourable David Johnston has also assisted several leadership debates, including in the elections of 1979 and 1984 federally, and the provincial elections in Ontario in 1987. He was also the moderator of public affairs shows on CBC News World and in PBS.
He will execute his role in a manner that is neutral, fair, and principled, and importantly, with the interests of Canadians at heart. Le commissaire sera également.
Commissioner shall be mandated to work closely with political parties, negotiating the conditions of the debates with media outlets to ensure broad broadcasting, and in particular with Canadians, to render them more aware of the debates.
Be to produce 2 debates that reflect the highest journalistic standards. By contracting out the role of content creation and format to a production entity, the themes, topics, and questions will all be in the hands of the production experts, not the commissioner. Regarding who can participate in national televised leaders' debates, we have established clear criteria that will need to be met by political party leaders. In 2019, debates would include leaders of political parties that meet 2 of the following 3 criteria. 1, have a member of Parliament elected as a member of that party in the House of Commons at the time the election is called. 2, intend to run candidates in at least 90% of electoral districts. And 3, have either obtained 4% of the vote in a previous election or a legitimate chance to win seats in the upcoming election. Ces critères de participation.
These criteria reflect the overall approach that has been used by the Broadcasting Consortium during prior elections. And they take into account the information and feedback we obtained while we were consulting Canadians. The Commissioner would be mandated to settle the final details of participation criteria and to apply them in 2019, as well as to present recommendations on criteria for future debates.
Fundamental exercise in democracy, and the Independent Commission will make debates a more predictable, reliable, and stable element of federal election campaigns. Les débats des chefs sont une excellente...
Leaders' debates are a vital part of our democracy, and the Independent Commission will make of these debates a more reliable, more stable, and more predictable part of our federal elections.
The Leaders' Debates Commission will ensure that all Canadians will have access to televised debates during the 2019 election campaign. Thank you again for having me here today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Minister. Well, now we're going to set a little mini precedent in history. The Liberals have generously given up the first slot, so the first time in history, the leader of the Green Party will have the first slot for 7 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all my colleagues. And I know how happy you are, David. It's really a good thing.
Oh, yeah.
Well, Madam Minister, wait. I will ignore that as unworthy of you. Hello, Madam Minister. It is the case that, as you said, the 2015 election campaign fell apart in terms of the leaders' debates when the leader of the Conservative Party and the leader of New Democrats both refused to participate, which was sad for me because, as you know, the consortium had said that under their rules, of course, the Green Party was now in the national leaders' debates, and it was at that moment unexpected, so one would say, speaking of precedents, unprecedented, that a sitting Prime Minister and the leader of another opposition party would work together to deprive a space in a debate to a party that had won a seat in the House of Commons. So I'm glad to see, as you know, I welcome the creation of a Leaders' Debate Commission. But can you just, for clarification purposes, outline what today you're presenting to us, which is new information over the proposal last time? Is David Johnston now not a nominee but the official debates commissioner? And the details around the content creation being done by a contracted out entity, that strikes me as new. If you could just highlight what you're presenting today, which is new information.
So there is actually no new information that I'm presenting today. The part around content creation was something that came up in the media afterwards, and we felt it was important to clarify that it is not, in fact, the debates commissioner that will be creating the debate. It is his mandate to ensure that the debates happen and to contract them out to a production entity.
Okay. Then if I can pursue what might be done that might have been new information. Last time I asked you, you hadn't had any conversations with what's known as the consortium. I referred to it a moment ago. So it was CBC, Global, CTV, TVA, and Radio-Canada, that as 5 news organizations have organized the debates ever since the late 1960s. Has there been any consultation with them as to whether they are prepared to work with the Debates Commission, whether they see this as a good thing? I've heard, over the years, they've certainly told me, individuals who are the heads of the news bureaus of those networks have said being the consortium was rather a thankless task and something that they would love to have someone else run. On the other hand, they've been pretty clear that this is their turf and they know how to organize and produce good debates. I'm wondering if any of what we're presenting now is based on talking with individuals or the consortium as a group.
So I would say that all of the consortium members were part of our consultation process and participated in the roundtables that my department, along with IRPP, organized, and their information certainly and their perspectives were taken into consideration through the consultation process. And what we did hear is that there was absolutely interest in continuing to play an important role. However, the commissioner will decide based on proposals that are submitted through a call for proposals as to the organizing entity, but we fully expect that there will be interest on their behalf to participate.
Because, of course, Madam Minister, one of the key things that the fly in the ointment with this would be if, having prepared and produced and providing a live feed, the large national networks didn't pick up on that opportunity to broadcast, and there's nothing here that compels them to broadcast. What's your level of confidence that they will broadcast what the Debates Commission produces?
So in our consultations, I would say that every participant reiterated the fact that if a feed were to be made available and free of charge, that it would be their public service to share that feed. And so there was absolutely a sense from everyone who participated, whether they were a broadcaster, a smaller organization, ethnic media, social media, really everyone that we spoke to, that if there was a possibility to share the feed, they would look for ways to share it publicly because they felt that it was part of their public duty to share that with Canadians.
Well, that is actually, I'm quite relieved to hear that. Now, if I go back many years ago, there was a report on leaders' debates produced by the Centre for the Study of Democracy at Queen's University under the leadership of Tom Axworthy at the time, and pointing out that in Westminster parliamentary democracy, we don't elect a prime minister, we don't have a presidential system, and the leaders' debates in some ways ape what happens in the U.S. and kind of can lead to Canadians forgetting that they're actually choosing their own member of parliament in a representative democracy in a constitutional monarchy in the Westminster system and not voting for a leader. I'm wondering if there's any way that the mandate for the Debates Commission can be broadened to meet some of the recommendations that came from that study from the Centre of Democracy of having debates, say, between a Minister of Immigration and each party's immigration critic, a Minister of Finance and each party's finance critic. The advice from that committee was, let's bring into sharper focus for Canadians that we are not a presidential system. Is there any scope for more than the main two signature debates?
So we intentionally left it that there was a minimum two main leaders' debates and enabling the commissioner to have flexibility for those kinds of creative ideas and to support organizations as they are interested in hosting other debates throughout the country, either with leaders or others. But that is a decision that would be left in the commission's hands. But that is why we said a minimum of two national debates, one in English and one in French. And I would say that throughout the consultations, we heard lots of new creative ideas and how to engage the Canadian public in debates in a broader way. And all of that information is available to the Commissioner, but it's also available publicly in the IRPP's public report on the roundtables.
Thank you. I think that's my time, Mr. Chair. I really appreciate this opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. May. Now, going on, setting precedents, we'll have the NDP next round for 7 minutes.
What you didn't explain is that normally it would go to the Conservatives. So
Yes.
in this case, the Conservatives handed off their lead to me.
Yes.
If anybody ever needed to know where the expression "politics makes for strange bedfellows" came from, this would be exactly that scenario. So I thank my colleagues in the Conservative caucus for an opportunity to jump ahead in the order of precedence. Let me begin, first of all, by expressing my personal respect for you, Minister. We're neighbors, neighboring cities, and for a while you were our regional minister, and you've done an outstanding job in that capacity, and I enjoy working with you. And everything I have to say is about your government and in your capacity as a minister and not as a person or as an MP, because on that front you have an impeccable reputation with me. Having said that, I got to tell you, if the Conservatives had attempted a move like this, the whole country would be enraged. But somehow, because it's the Liberals, it's not as horrible a thing. But I have to tell you, this is a disgraceful expression of lack of democracy, again, on the democratic reform file. So let's remember, too, that there's a context to this. There's a history and a pattern. This government said that the last election we had was the last one we'd have first past the post. They broke that promise, set that aside. Then they brought in a whole series of draconian House changes to our House standing orders, moves that Stephen Harper would never even dream of, and they had to retreat on that because of the backlash. C-33, we were in the middle, this committee, of doing a major intensive review of the recommendations from the Chief Electoral Officer, and that report was supposed to help advise the government because they promised that committees were going to matter from now on, and we were going to go back to respecting the independence of committees and allowing committees to do their good parliamentary work. And that was trounced on by virtue of C-33. Their major reform bill to the election laws was dumped on the floor of Parliament while we were still in the midst of reviewing that report. And that led to a filibuster by a certain somebody that tied us up for goodness knows how long until we managed to get that mess that the government caused unraveled. Now, here we are again on a major issue, and I don't disagree with the importance as underscored by the Minister and by my friend Madame May. But the process matters. This is a democracy. And we spent a lot of time working hard on that report. And two of the key things, the biggest rubs that we had the greatest difficulty with were, how do we decide who the commissioner would be? And what about the criteria for who's in debates? None of us at the committee level, and I'll include my colleagues in the Liberal caucus for this part of it, none of us felt adequate to make that decision as a committee made up of members from all the parties. And yet now this government has come along and said, and here's their rationale. Here's the thing. I claim the reason they had to do this was because they've mismanaged this file so bad that they didn't leave enough time. In fact, we just barely got the last major bill through again because of the government's mismanagement. In their own backgrounder, for justification for ignoring this committee and running roughshod over democracy, here was their rationale. Quote, in the interest of time and as a starting point for the upcoming 2019 debates. As if nobody had talked about it yet. As if nobody was paying any attention and the government went, oh, wait a minute, we should do something and there's really not enough time to do it, so we'll just make that decision. Look, this is so important, and I am so profoundly disappointed that the government has been so undemocratic in their approach here and so unilateral. So my only question, I guess, would be, at this point, where on earth do the Liberals, never mind government, the Liberals, where do they get off believing that they have the almighty power and right to unilaterally appoint the commissioner and unilaterally decide who's in the debates and who isn't in the debates? Where do the Liberals get off believing they have the right to make that decision when we collectively at the committee level that the government was supposed to respect have said we need to put it into a process so it's fair? How does the government, how do the Liberals justify them saying, no, we know better and we'll just set aside what the committee said?
Thank you, David. We did listen to the committee, and in fact, 10 of the 12 recommendations are directly reflected in this proposal. And you and I both agree that leaders' debates are crucial for Canadians to be a part of. We also listened to the committee and appreciated the fact that this is a challenging process, which is why we have put forward a two-step process to have something in place for this election, to see how it goes, and then to have the commissioner, who is independent from government, come back, report to this committee on how best to make this a permanent process. And I firmly and strongly believe that Mr. Johnston is absolutely the right person for the job. He is above partisanship. He has an incredible amount of personal integrity. He has consistently served this country, put public interest above everything else, and ultimately that's what this process is about. It's about ensuring Canadians can see their main political leaders debate each other, their policies, appreciate their characters, so that they can make a decision and a choice for who they want to govern themselves in 2019.
Minister, that's your talking point. You didn't answer my question. My question was, where do the Liberals believe they have the right to unilaterally make decisions that we collectively at this table felt shouldn't be made unilaterally and that ought to be into a democratic process? That was my question. Was where do the Liberals get off believing that you have the right to make those decisions when this committee, you said your government was going to respect committees, this committee said, we don't feel right making that decision. You didn't answer my questions. The macro thing I'd like to know is, how are you going to fix this stink? Because right now, an important element of the next election is clouded in at least concern and debate. How are you going to legitimize this without first having it go through this committee? How are you going to do that?
Minister, very briefly, because the time's up.
Thanks, Chair.
So we did listen to the committee because one of the recommendations from the committee was to ensure that criteria was established well in advance. And that is precisely what we are doing. We are doing that, and the commissioner will have the ultimate discretion. But I think that all those around the table would agree that Mr. Johnston has an absolute level of integrity. We strove to ensure that the person appointed initially, our nominee, would be above the fray and would always place the interests of Canadians at the heart of every decision that he is making in this context.
You hoped would cover up your anti-democratic process.
Okay, thank you. We'll now go on to Ms. Cusi.
Thank you, Mr. President. And Minister, always lovely to see you. Sure. So my first question goes back to Mr. Christopherson's. In what way do you feel that the appointment of Mr. Johnson is democratic in the sense that, I received a phone call from you the morning of the announcement saying, this is who the candidate is. There was no consultation with myself or the other parties as we're hearing now. And in fact, we didn't even receive a short list, and again, I think we're all in agreement here of it's not the quality or the integrity of the candidate, it's the process. We don't know the process. For us, there was no process, but perhaps if you could expand on how you feel that was a democratic process when none of us were consulted in regards to not only a short list or discussion of candidates beyond that, but the selection of the candidate himself. How is that democratic?
Thank you. So I think that all of us agree on the integrity of the nominee that we have put forward. And in fact, each member of this committee had the chance to question Mr. Johnston, I believe it was 2 weeks ago, on his plans and his intentions. And I strongly believe and stand by the fact that he is absolutely the right person for this job, that he will ensure a fair process when it comes to ensuring that those two debates happen, to ensure that as many Canadians are included in the process as possible. And I take issue with the fact that we did not consult, because absolutely this committee played an essential role in coming up with the proposal that we have here before you today with regards to leaders' debates, as well as Canadians across the country. Over 14,000 Canadians submitted during our online consultation, as well as the roundtables that we held with experts, academics.
Well, thank you, Minister. I'm very happy to hear you're comforted that we weren't provided the opportunity to consult. Do you have similar feelings in regards to the fact that the appointment was not brought through the House of Commons, which would have allowed for adequate debate as well as a vote in regards to the candidate? Do you have some regret or remorse over that? And were you to be involved in a future process, would you hope that a selection would involve a more democratic process through the House, whereby there is debate and there is the opportunity for consensus within the House?
So I won't prejudge a future process, but what I do think is important to note, as I have reiterated several times, is the fact that we have put forward a two-step process, and that this is an interim measure to test it out to see how it goes in 2019 and have mandated the commissioner to come back to this committee and to the House with a proposal for how to move forward. And that is something that I think will be quite important in terms of how we create a stable process moving forward. And I'm sure that this experience will inform the commissioner's suggestion and recommendations following the 2019 election and how leaders' debates were conducted.
So we are calling this an independent commission, and yet it's funded by the Liberal government. It was created by the Liberal government, and it's the Liberal government that decides the criteria for political parties, party leaders, to participate within the debates. So given all of that, how can we possibly say that this is an independent commission?
Well, if you take that line of reasoning, Ms. Kusi, then you would question the independence of any entity that has public funding, which I think is not the direction that you would like to go. However, the funding is provided to the commissioner, and he will determine how that money is used. We wanted to ensure he has sufficient resources available to produce 2 high-quality debates, one in each official language, and to ensure that it is diffused as widely as possible.
So Marie Vastel de Le Devoir, Andrew Coyne of the National Post, one of my favorites, Chris Sully of the National Post, Chantal Hébert of the Toronto Star, and Colby Cash of the National Post have all written articles indicating that this is a bad idea. How can your government possibly think that you have the support of the journalistic community and sector when there have been so many journalists, so many leading journalists who have come out in opposition to this idea?
So, Ms. Kusi, the key audience for this is Canadians. Ultimately, we want Canadians to be able to see their leaders debate. And the whole
And you don't think these top professionals know how to do that, given their experience?
Guiding principle of this proposal and the reason for creating a commission is to have Canadians' interests at the heart of it. And that is specifically what we are doing. We are ensuring that the commissioner will have sufficient resources to ensure that a broadcasting entity will be able to produce quality debates for Canadians that will meet high journalistic standards, and also ensuring that the questions, the format, are determined by those who are best able to do that.
Is it true that one of the 7 positions is held for a PCO member?
There are 7 advisory positions that the commissioner will choose. This is based on the consultations that we have conducted across the country that wanted to ensure that there was broad representation of diverse groups, of women, official language minority communities, the accessibility community.
So is that a yes or a no, please?
And so it is up to the commissioner to determine who will fulfill those 7 advisory positions.
Finally, do you think $595 million as outlined in the federal economic update, fall economic update yesterday, contributes to a democratic media?
So we have fundamentally different views about the news and journalism, and on our side of the House, we believe that a strong, free, independent press is an absolute must and pillar in a democracy.
Funded by the government.
And if we do not have that robust media landscape in Canada, our democracy will be at peril.
Thank you, Minister.
Thank you, Ms. Kusi. And now we'll go on maintenant, Madame Lapointe.
Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and welcome, Minister. Welcome, Mr. Sutherland. I would like to begin by quoting our colleague David Christopherson.
We had Mr. Johnson. You are the gold standard, the beginning of the station, okay? The quote. You are the gold standard of public service, and I can imagine any position for which you wouldn't be eminently qualified to represent Canadians and bring that fairness and values and your integrity and your intelligence, your experience to bear. I can't emphasize enough, sir, that any of my comments that are negative are addressed to the process, to the government, to everything except you. I have the highest regard for you, as does my caucus, and if the end of the day you end up being the debater commissioner, whereas a country would be well served. Just the end of the quote. And after that, I have my question. Alors, Madame la Ministre, je vais continuer en français.
Honourable Minister, I shall continue in French. You said that the televised debates would be broadcast across the country and available everywhere. Of course, we both know that Canada is a very large land. And will the Commission, therefore, ensure that all Canadians living in rural and remote areas will have access to all the debates, and how will that be ensured? An excellent question. And this is something that we also heard during our consultations on the leaders' debates. I would like to underscore that when we were in Halifax, to take that example, we heard from the French official language minority community that told us that during the last elections, they hadn't had access to a leaders' debate in French in Nova Scotia. That was one of the comments, and similar comments as well convinced us that we needed to ensure that everyone across Canada, no matter where they lived and no matter where they were and no matter what their language, official language was, needed to be able to access the debates. As for rural areas and remote areas, it's essential to ensure that people there also access the debates. So the Commissioner has a mandate to ensure that debates will be available to all. How will that be done? That will be up to him. One of the tools, though, that we have foreseen providing him with is ensuring that the debates be free, be broadcast free. Whoever the broadcaster, whatever the broadcasting firm or enterprise on radio, TV, over the internet, or even paper format, ensuring that everyone would have free access to the debates. Thank you. My second question. When the committee produced a report, they insisted on access to information and education. Very important, because young people need to be involved in this whole process as soon as they are of age to vote. So how will we ensure that young Canadians have access to the democratic process? How will the Commission ensure that? Once again, the Commission's work will involve choosing how they will go about this. But what we have heard, not merely from this committee, of importance, of course, but also across Canada, is that Canadians need to know and receive information about how the debates will be held. Why some leaders participate, why others don't, what the criteria that feed into that decision are. What counts is ensuring that the whole debate creation process is transparent. That's a mandate of the commissioners, ensuring transparency as to how this will work. The commissioner is also empowered to inform Canadians about the debates, how they occur, where and when they will occur, and how Canadians can participate and listen and hear the debates. Thank you. I've got another question. You pointed out the criteria. Looking at the House of Commons now and how it is set up, the criteria are to have a member of Parliament elected as a member of that party in the House of Commons at the time of the election when it's called, to intend to run candidates in at least 90% of electoral districts, and to have obtained 4% of the vote in a previous election. So, given the current political context, for example, based on these criteria, which parties would be eligible to participate in the debate? Based on these criteria, all parties now represented in the House of Commons. The Liberal Party, the Conservative Party, the New Democratic Party, the Conservatives, and the Bloc Québécois. The third criteria is somewhat flexible. If there should be a change in the political approaches, if there's a new party leader that does indeed have a good political movement behind them, then they would be included as well, and the Commissioner would have the discretion to make that determination. So if I understand correctly, new parties, well, the third criteria, the 4% of the vote, it would be up to the Commissioner to decide whether that would apply or not, or how that would apply, yes, based on public polls, on other information that might show that that party had a legitimate chance to win seats in the upcoming election in the House of Commons. So this would be up to the Commissioner, together with their commission, to apply these criteria. Yes. Thank you, Ms. Lapointe.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Minister, for being here. It's always a pleasure to have you here. Always enjoy your testimony and your insight. I wanted to say, however, that I am disappointed by the way in which the proposal is being structured, and I'm particularly disappointed by the way in which the three criteria have been set up there. Under the rules, parties must meet with two of the three criteria listed by the government in order to participate in the leaders' debate. And in setting up these criteria, the government has abandoned the proposals made by the majority in this committee, and has also ignored the advice of Stéphane Perreault, our Chief Electoral Officer. Let me start with Mr. Perreault's comments, which are paraphrased on page 28 of our report. Mr. Perreault, I'm quoting here, told the committee that it was, in his view, preferable for Parliament to decide the criteria for participation in the leaders' debates and have the independent debates organizing entity apply those criteria in a mechanical fashion with no room for discretion. The reason for this was that should a debates organizing entity be created as a federal body, it would be subject to the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Mr. Perreault noted that past legal challenges to decisions surrounding leaders' debates under Charter failed on the basis that the debates were essentially private debates and not subject to Charter scrutiny. End quote. So it's hard to escape the belief that the purpose of setting up this quasi-private entity to oversee the debates is to create a situation in which the Debates Commission and its decisions will be exempt from Charter scrutiny, meaning that it may well be the case that the debates will be organized in such a way as to violate the Charter and no one will have recourse. Is that not in fact why it was set up this way?
It was set up this way because, as this committee recommended, that we should ensure that criteria were established well in advance. We wanted to ensure that the Commissioner had, as Mr. Perreault stated in your quote that you stated right now, was able to implement them in a mechanical way that would take that individual out of the political decision-making process.
If I may interrupt, there's nothing mechanical about the fact that when Mr. Johnson was here, I asked him a question about what criteria he would use in order to establish that a party leader would qualify or not, whether they have a realistic chance of winning seats, and he said he'd look into it. I believe he'll be thoughtful, but the fact is that the criteria will be set up too late for any action to be taken to protect Charter rights, and moreover, they are absolutely not transparent. They are not applied. It's the opposite of mechanical. There is 100% absolute discretion on his part.
We had to allow for some discretion because, as political context can change rapidly, we need to ensure that if there is a surge in support for a candidate or an individual across the country, that they are not excluded from leaders' debates.
Right. If you excuse me again, I apologize. In the committee's report, it stated that we should meet a threshold of aggregated public opinion 6 months or at some other time prior to the scheduled general election. You could have said 6 months, 3 months, picked a number so that it would be applied mechanically. You did not do so. The next question I wanted to ask is this. With regard to the criteria that are being used, I note that the criteria state that a party leader will be permitted to be in the debate if that party won 4% of the vote at a previous election, not the previous election, any previous election. This is designed perfectly to ensure that the Green Party, which won 3.7% of the vote in 2015, only 3.9% in 2011, gets to be grandfathered in forever because they won 6.7% of the vote in 2008. The Bloc Québécois will be grandfathered in forever because it won 4.6% of the vote in 2015, even if it's down to one MP. So we're going to have a separatist party coming to every debate, including the English ones, forever because of the fact that they historically won that percentage of the vote. Why on earth did you pick that criteria other than to win Ms. Green's support so that you could pretend you had multi-partisan consent to this approach?
So, Mr. Reid, as you will note that it's actually in number 3, it says the party's candidates for the most recent general election received at that election at least 4% of the vote. So I have to just correct the record there. But it's 2 out of 3 criteria. So it could be that 4% at the last general election, or have a member who was elected to the House at the time of election under that party, or run candidates in 90%
Looking at your
of
website, that is
elections.
not what it says. At your website, it says, item 3, have either obtained 4% of the vote in a previous election. This is your website, in a previous election, or a legitimate chance to win seats in the upcoming election. Criteria number 1 is the one that refers to having a member of Parliament elected to the House of Commons at the time the election is called. This is your website, so what you just quoted to us is not what your website says.
So this is the mandate that was given to the debates commissioner, and we will share that.
Why does your website say something different than what you just quoted? I'm reading it right now. I'm online at your website, Leaders Debate Commission, Government of Canada. Right this minute, it says something different than what you were saying. Why is that?
Well, I will share the actual OIC with you.
Maybe you could correct your website too. If what the Canadians have been reading up till now is not what your position is, then maybe you want to get that straightened out, eh?
No, we will absolutely correct it, but this is the OIC that I have here in front of me that is the correct language.
Okay, thank you. Now we'll go to Ms. Sahota.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That was an interesting exchange. It's not like Mr. Reid to not want participation of more parties, more thought, more opinions. That's what we've mostly heard on this committee in the past, and I've always respected that opinion before. So I think the fear. I feel that what we're doing right now is, I can understand the perspectives coming from the other side, but I don't want us to lose sight of the forest for the trees. And what I do want to find out from the minister right now is if you could just remind us, I know you've touched upon it a little bit before, but how the commission that you've announced, how it has aligned with a lot of the recommendations that the committee has put forward, and what kind of consultations you did engage with, what kind of consultations the government engaged to ensure that stakeholders were heard before you made this commission.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much, Ruby, for those questions. So as I stated earlier, we engaged quite widely in the consultation process. We had an online consultation process. Over 14,000 Canadians submitted to that. We organized roundtables with my department and also the Institute on Research and Public Policy. We had over 60 different stakeholders from traditional media, new media, academics, different stakeholders, Indigenous representation, disability groups, minority language groups, women's groups. Really, we tried to reach out as broadly as we possibly could to ensure what we heard from them was the importance that Canadians place on leaders' debates. That leaders' debates for Canadians are key decision-making moments in terms of who they want to be governed by, the policies that they hold dear, and understanding how they are going to react and interact with each other in tough decision-making moments. And one of the things that we heard time and time again is that it was one of the few opportunities during an election campaign to spontaneously engage with a political party leader. And it demonstrated character, and it demonstrated what that leader, how they were going to act as a potential Prime Minister, and that was so important for Canadians across the country, and that in 2015, although there were more debates, fewer Canadians across the country were able to access them, and that was something that they felt needed to be rectified.
And from the criteria that has been talked about here today, it seems to me that it has been formulated in such a way that we want to be, that we would be able to provide more of an opportunity to more parties to be able to participate in this process. Is that correct?
The idea with this participation criteria is to ensure that those who have a legitimate chance of entering into the House of Commons and forming government will be able to engage with other political leaders and for Canadians to interact with them.
Okay. I've also, you had mentioned a little bit earlier, Minister, about Mr. Johnson's qualifications. And I'd like to, I've looked at a lot of the work that he's done, and also there's been a lot of statements made by prominent people about the work he's done and how well he served even as Governor General. I'd like to point at a quote by the RIM founder. And he said that Mr. Johnson has led the University of Waterloo during the most prolific growth period in its history. He has worked tirelessly to position the University of Waterloo as a world-class institution of math, science, engineering, health, and arts. David's strong understanding of law and the Canadian Constitution, combined with his great communication skills, charm, and real ability to achieve consensus among stakeholders, will serve him well in the role of Governor General. Now, I would think that those qualities, those skills that were listed in that quote would be essential to a commissioner in this position. Can you elaborate a little bit about how consensus achieving, being able to be somebody who can bring people to the table, may avoid the situation we had in 2015?
In 20 seconds.
I think that being a consensus builder, someone who is above partisanship, someone who places the interests of Canadians at the heart of every decision he has taken, will absolutely serve him well in what is a very challenging position, but one that is vital for the health of our democracy and for Canadians in the upcoming election.
Thank you, Minister. Now we'll go to Mr. Nader.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Minister, for joining us today. I would just note my concern that what's being told to Canadians on your website differs from what is included in the Order in Council. I think that's a significant concern and an affront to Parliament, but also to Canadians, that different information is being provided to different people.
And we will rectify that.
I'm not an expert
for bringing that to our attention.
No, I appreciate that. Now, I'm not an expert on the operations of government, so I do look to your guidance and that of your departmental staff. But I'm curious, when the debate commissioner was appointed by the tabling in the House of Commons pursuant to Order 110.2, it was considered the debates commissioner. Just curious, where in enabling legislation does the concept of debates commissioner exist? By what legislative authority does that come to be?
This is an Order in Council position,
okay,
so it does not require legislation.
So in the Order in Council, it takes notes of the establishment of the Leaders Debate Commission and the Secretariat. Is there no process by which Parliament granted approval for that?
It does not require legislation to make an Order in Council position. That's the prerogative of the government.
No.
However, we did encourage this committee to engage with the commissioner, and as I've mentioned before, we see this as a two-step process and are keenly looking forward to how this process rolls out over the coming year, and of course the recommendations from the Commissioner following the 2019 election, at which point there is a possibility that it could be recommended to be in statute.
Now again, I'm no parliamentary historian, but I do remember something from a few hundred years of history going back to the power of the purse, the supremacy of Parliament, where government cannot do that which Parliament has not authorized. So I do find it curious that in this sense it is the government without parliamentary approval going ahead and establishing this entity. But I want to follow up on something that is in your Order in Council. It states very clearly, the Leaders Debates Commission is an agent of Her Majesty, and in that capacity may enter into contracts or agreements with third parties in fulfilling its mandate. Now, when we think of agent of Her Majesty, we may think of a former Governor General serving in that capacity. But in this sense, would you not agree that an agent of Her Majesty actually refers to being an agent of Her Majesty's government? Is that not correct?
We needed to establish a entity by which the commissioner would be able to enter into contract. That will be something that is entirely up to the Debates Commission, how they do that. He will operate independently, as has been said. He will be choosing the 7-member advisory panel and deciding how his office will be staffed. We are simply ensuring that he will have the resources and tools at his disposal to be able to conduct his work.
As an agent of the government, correct?
As an independent actor who will have the tools and resources at his disposal. However, beyond providing those resources, all decisions will be his own and he will be acting independently.
Doesn't mention that in Section 5, subsection 1, but we'll carry on. You mentioned that the feed would be taken and provided to all broadcasters free of charge. I would note in the last election, all 5 debates were carried by CPAC, our public broadcaster, which did an exceptional job carrying those. I would note that other broadcasters did not do so, despite the feed being provided for them. We saw reruns of Coronation Street. So I would just put this as a note, as a comment, that I think you're being overly optimistic to think that the major broadcasters will automatically jump on board when they did not do so in the last election. I do want to end there. I will give my last minute to Mr. Christofferson.
Thank you, Mr. Nader. Chair, I move that this committee immediately begin reviewing the government's announced Leaders Debate Commission and make any necessary recommendations in a timely report to Parliament.
Okay, that motion's open for debate. Mr. Nader?
I think I want to agree with Mr. Christofferson's motion. I mean, it makes perfect sense. This type of entity ought to have been established by legislation. That would have been the appropriate thing to done. It would have gone through the legislative process. It would have gone through Parliament. It would have had given us the opportunity to have a meaningful discussion and debate on how this entity ought to function and ought to operate. We as a committee did an extensive report. We didn't agree on all the points. We provided a supplementary opinion from the Conservative opposition, but our biggest concern from the start was very much what's happened here, that the government would unilaterally act. That was the concerns that the Conservative Party had, and that's exactly what came to fruition in this outcome. So barring the fact that I don't see the government being eager to actually table legislation to actually implement this program, I think Mr. Christofferson makes a good point. Let's review this. Let's work as a committee and review what's been proposed, review the order in council, review the appointments, bring the proposed appointee in to discuss. We had opportunity to discuss with him his qualifications, but his qualifications did not allow us to talk about his proposals for the entity. Rightfully, you, Mr. Chair, kept us from going that direction, as is the right of this committee and outside of the scope of that presentation. But we have not had the opportunity to discuss with the appointee what his proposals are, what the options are, who might and ought to be on the 7-person advisory panel, who ought to be the appropriate people there, what mechanisms may be in place to ensure that there's a wide broadcast, and wide beyond simply broadcasters. I've mentioned this before in this committee that individuals in my generation, and your generation as well, Minister, our generation, our collective generation, do not turn to the major broadcasters for their news. I saw a poll recently, fewer than 50%. So I think that barring, I'm not going to speak any longer, Chair. I just want to put on record that I think that this is an important and worthwhile discussion to have. I think Mr. Christofferson made a perfectly reasonable explanation. Let's look at this. If we're not going to have legislation, let's look at this.
Okay, carrying on the debate on the motion, Mr. Christofferson, keeping in mind the Minister will be here for 2 more minutes.
Yeah, no, and I don't want to filibuster my own motion. I just want to say...
Oh, okay.
I just want to say that in doing this, it would help provide at least some modicum of legitimacy to the creation of this commission as opposed to where we are right now.
Mr. Reid, you got about a minute before the minister. In this section of the...
Yeah, I unfortunately don't know how to speak to this and ask the minister a question unless we want to, on the fly, adopt the Sims rule codicil for witnesses.
If it's
maybe...
If it's okay with the minister, go ahead. You've got less than a minute now. Ask her a question.
All right. It's simply this. Could you tell us how... I just want to come back to my... Okay. How did you get this incredible mess up where you've got one thing being told to the public and on your website and one thing being told to the in your order in council? Are we to assume, it certainly seems plausible, that we got a draft version on the website, so we're planning you adjusted it, or what's the basis for that? Will you report back to us on how this mess occurred?
We will certainly look into it.
Will you report back to us?
We'll report back.
You'll send a written report?
Sure.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much.
Human error.
Yeah.
Probably.
Now, can I go on to the rest of the stuff?
Yeah.
Or do you want to let her go, or?
I don't think it's, yeah.
Basically, our time for the minister's up, so maybe we'll suspend and then come back.
All right.
Okay? Suspend for a minute or so here.
Okay.
Thank you, Minister.
Thank you.
straightforward. It appears to, at first glance, but a closer examination reveals that it is in fact not the same thing as was proposed. It is not, for example, a fully independent commission, and the commissioner himself is almost certainly not a fully independent individual by any stretch of the imagination. Once one examines the nature of his appointment, my colleague, Mr. Nader, will be speaking to that point when the floor goes to him. But it is, I think, of fundamental importance to point out that this body is structured in such a way, and its decision-making power is structured in such a way that it is has a great deal of discretionary authority, something which was specifically spoken against by the Chief Electoral Officer of Canada, who said it is vital that this body, the Commissioner and the Commission, be set up in such a way that they are subject to charter challenge, something which has been denied by setting it up through an order in council. This means that the Commission could make decisions which have the effect of trampling on some one or more of the rights protected in the Charter. The most obvious one, to my perspective, would be Section 3, the right of citizens to vote, which, if interpreted broadly and purposively, which is the way in which the Supreme Court normally recommends we treat Charter provisions, or giving it what was known in the old days as a large and liberal interpretation, large and liberal being a synonym for purposive interpretation. If it's read broadly, that includes the right to do so in an environment in which the party in power is not setting the rules, not privileging itself, not stripping away the powers of others. I note that under the criteria laid out here, the party that I joined in 1990, the Reform Party, would not have been eligible to have a participant in the leaders' debates because of the fact that it didn't meet all the criteria. Yeah, no, I understand that. We would not have met two of the three. At the time, it was considering whether or not it would run candidates across the country. And in 1993, it did make that decision. It had one member of Parliament elected under its, in a by-election under its banner, but had Deborah Gray not successfully contested that by-election 4 years in advance of the general election in which I ran, the party would have had a problem. So this is something which appears to follow a pattern that I have seen here since I was here as a staffer in the 1990s, which is to say the efforts of the incumbent parties. In those days, as a reformer, we used to say, Liberal, Tory, same old story. The two incumbent parties were trying to freeze out their competitors, new parties that were competing against them. We've all faced challenges from new parties. The NDP came out of the CCF, but the CCF was an insurgent party that came in. The Reform Party and subsequently the Canadian Alliance, under whose banner I was elected, similar story. The Bloc Québécois, similar story. And I note that under the criteria laid out here, although the Bloc Québécois can participate in leaders' debates forever and ever and ever, as long as they elect one member of Parliament, they could not have contested and had a candidate in the 1993 leaders' debates, where they became the official opposition because of the fact that they had nobody elected under the party banner in the previous election. There was a by-election. One member, Gilles Duceppe, had been elected as an independent and therefore not under the party's banner. So even though they had someone who had successfully run for them, they still wouldn't have qualified because they didn't meet the number of seat criteria. They did not have somebody who'd been elected in the previous elections. They would not have had two of the three. And yet they became the official opposition, and they got, in that election, 13.5% of the vote. Now they're down to 4.6% of the vote. Ms. May is down to 3.7% of the vote, but they're in for eternity in leaders' debates. So this is clearly very problematic indeed, and deserves the review of the committee whose recommendations were not taken, although there was a pro forma effort at making it look like they had been taken by the government. The government's actions in this regard are disappointing, and self-serving, quite frankly, perhaps not unexpected. Anyway, on that basis, I think there's a strong argument for us to do so. I do note that Mr. Christofferson, in his motion, says that we would report back in a timely report to Parliament. I heartily agree with that. Our report to the House of Commons, in my view, should happen before Christmas. I think that's a reasonable thing. The evidence is now in front of us. We can move quickly, and that allows us to do so in a manner that does not in any way prevent a commission that meets more accurately with the recommendations made by this committee, in which, of course, my party didn't concur, but Mr. Christofferson did concur in those recommendations, and his party did. That just seems at least more consensual than what was done with this particular order in council. I'll stop there, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for your generosity in accommodating this debate when we had scheduled something else. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Reid. We'll go on to Ms. Kuzi.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I too am in support of this motion. I think that there are just too many unanswered questions in terms of how this commission and the position of the debate commissioner came to be, which I believed we outlined in some extent this morning when the minister was in fact here. And I certainly brought some of those to light, and they included the lack of transparency regarding the process to determine the appointment of the commissioner. I mean, I think we all felt very strongly that Mr. Johnson is indeed a very strong candidate. Certainly not only given his professional background and certainly his official background as an official of the state, and certainly I think we'd be hard pressed as conservatives to find any fault with his experience and his background, and certainly him having been appointed by our previous leader and the previous prime minister. But I think it was certainly more so in regards to how we feel as though we were, and we are not alone in this feeling. It's also been indicated by our colleagues from other parties that we were not provided the opportunity to submit names. I did not submit nary a name. In fact, I didn't even get any consideration because I wasn't asked to give it consideration. But in addition to that, we did not receive a short list, sort of to do a comparative analysis, to decide if, one candidate might have qualities over another that might serve the Canadian public well in the role of debate commissioner, because, certainly this role does require a special individual with special talents, and it's very important that we take the time to evaluate those, and in this case certainly even in a comparative analysis, as I said, but we weren't provided with that opportunity to do such an analysis. Not at all. In fact, it was a morning, not a cold morning like this morning, but a morning where I received the phone call from the minister. I was looking out over Ottawa thinking, what a great day. And, she had the news that Mr. Johnston had been chosen as the candidate. And certainly, again, I was pleasantly surprised to hear that it was Mr. Johnson, because as I indicated, we have no qualms, to use a popular phrase, in regards to Mr. Johnson. But again, the way in which it was determined. So that's certainly a concern. Well, in fact, we don't even know how it was determined. In fact, we'll never know the other candidates that the government considered. We'll probably never know that. The other names that ended up deleted, refused, sent back, those will always be a mystery to us, most probably. having been left with this one single candidate. But moving on, they, as I said, are indicated as well, and I was very relieved actually to see the minister express regret that there was no further exploration as to other people in other capacities in an attempt to do this. But the second point which I brought up to the minister was that this appointment was not brought through the House of Commons, which would have allowed adequate debate and a vote. And I mean, well, we here in the opposition, we're no strangers to having debate shut down, I'll tell you that. Many of my days, many of my mornings, to talk about mornings again, have been absolutely ruined by time allocation. And the list of things I had planned, the things I was going to accomplish, just all never came to pass because of time allocation votes. And here is yet another situation where there has not been allowed a fulsome debate in the House. Never mind a vote, even debate, but a vote as well, because isn't that really all why we are here? To vote, to express the will of our constituents and of Canadians, really. And I mean, that's certainly something that the minister talked a lot about this morning, doing this for Canadians. Well, are we really expressing the will of Canadians if we, as their representatives, did not have the opportunity to vote on their behalf on not even a list of candidates, but a candidate? I mean, this did not happen. And debate, I mean, my goodness, there was just so much to debate here in regards to the process, the composition of the commission, the number of the debates, the language format of the debates, the information regarding the broadcasting. I mean, we literally could have spent hundreds of hours, I think, on debate. Well, certainly dozens of hours on debate. I will say that, if this is something that truly affects Canadians so directly and so consequentially, because as I've stated from the beginning, the debate format is how Canadians get to know the individual who will be the leader of their nation. This is a very integral part of that. That certainly they'll read articles online, they may catch clips on TV. All leaders during the election will be out and about, pressing their platforms and in all parts of the nation, attempting to meet people and to sell their ideas. But this format, the debate format, is just something that is very, very integral to allowing Canadians to make decisions. I mean, what could be more important than that? And the fact that we were not able to debate that within the House and bring it to a vote is just incredibly unfortunate, and really, in my opinion, my humble opinion, can't be called democratic. And then we talked about this term, independent commission. Now, independent commission, that itself is not a paradox. But if I were to say government independent commission, that is a paradox right there. Two words which just don't belong beside each other. Independent government commission. I guess I should invert those two words. That's actually probably more appropriate in terms of how we might express it. But, as I indicated this morning, how can this possibly be independent when in fact it is funded by the Liberal government? And the minister did make me think a little bit when she talked about, well, we could say that about all entities. Well, yes, I guess we could, but yesterday, for example, when we had the fall economic statement, it's clearly defined as the government's fall economic statement. It wasn't the independent fall economic statement. It was the federal government's fall economic statement. Yet this is claiming to be independent. The two are actually very different. As I said, it was created by the Liberal government. Those are my favorite games, where I get to make up the rules really like those games a lot. But created by the Liberal government, and the criteria, which we've seen, which my colleague here, Mr. Reid, has shown out, is very, well, in fact, it's conflictual. It's conflictual within its own context and within its presentation, as we are finding out, between the differences between the Order in Council and what is on the website. I mean, so, gosh, I mean, we can't even determine with certainty what they intend the criteria to be, much less what the interpretation of the criteria is. We're at a loss in both those senses, which really, really begs the necessity for this further review, without question. Especially this third one, determine success or whatever in the next election. I mean, my goodness, like what do we use? Magic 8 ball? I don't know, crystal ball? Who knows? I mean, what data predicts I mean, I guess we can look to past data in an effort to predict the future, but it's never really perfect, is it? And I think, in fact, we've seen that with polls more and more in recent history, as we've sort of seen some surprising outcomes from elections. But anyway, as I was indicating, the criteria are not clear. As well, I was very disturbed to hear that one of the advisory positions goes to, as I understand it, goes to a PCO member. I mean, if that doesn't scream not independent, I really don't know what does. And maybe if the Prime Minister was to sit, is that independent? Probably not. But it's sort of getting there. If someone from the PCO is certainly a member of this advisory commission, without question. And I also indicated to the minister that many of the leading industry participants, top journalists, I mentioned Chantal Hébert, Marie Vastel, Andrew Coyne. As I said, I really like Andrew Coyne. He's just always right on the money, I'd say. But also Chris Selly, Colby Cash. I just feel like I grew up with that guy. Just feel when I read his column, I'm just like, we always seem to have been in the same place at the same time. But my point is, all of these top journalists are coming out against this idea of this debate commission. And I really think that is an indicator of the necessity for this study. Because, I mean, really, yes, this is supposed to be for Canadians, as the minister indicated. But who better to guide us in terms of the information that Canadians want to have, and need to know, I would say. That's a term we hear a lot in our society in this day and age, need to know. But the information that Canadians need to know in an effort to make their decision, like possibly one of the most important decisions that they can make. So, as I indicated, sort of all of these top journalists and all these top people in their field have, in fact, come out against this idea, and that really warrants review when those who have historically played this role are saying this is a bad idea. I mean, that should be like a flashing red light, certainly an amber light, if nothing else, to be like, whoa, slow down, let's reevaluate this, let's see what we're doing here, really. So those things are all very, very important to consider. And, unfortunately, I think that this debate commissioner sort of just comes at a time where we are questioning democracy in terms of some of the actions we have seen within this government. Many of the ideas in 76, Bill C-76, which we've discussed like ad length, ad nauseum, including, from our perspective, the spending limits, That's something very concerning. But in terms of the fact that, as it is, five third parties could outspend a registered party. That's very concerning. We've seen a lot of concern in regards to the voter cards, making sure that there is legitimacy of the electorate. That's very, very important. As well, the non-residential requirements. Very concerning. Foreign interference, once again. We saw that, we were told in this bill, this is bad, don't do that. But were the mechanisms to specifically prohibit this from ever happening legislated? No, they were not. And so therefore, they are still in play. And then, of course, there is the aspect of foreign influence, which the bill did not touch at all. And as time goes on, I'm seeing this more and more also as a defense perspective, or a defense issue, not just a democratic institutions issue, but it certainly has an effect on our democratic institutions when this type of activity occurs, and we need to be ready for it. In fact, I was just in Silicon Valley over the weekend, and I had the incredible opportunity to watch a panel with the Vice President of Communications of Facebook, Mr. Elliot Schrage, and he in fact was dealing with a serious external breach the day before, and it just takes an example like that to show you how effectual this type of activity can be. Really, it's one of those things you think is never going to happen, and then lo and behold, it happens. And we can't just hide our heads in the sand and pretend that this isn't going to occur. We have to take real measures to absolutely make sure that excuse me, that this doesn't come to pass. And in fact, I was really lucky. I had a real education in Silicon Valley in regards to these types of security breaches, which I think in fact could be part of our review as we go on to evaluate the possibility of a review. So I'm just going to go over a few of them, which I just thought were so fascinating. So Saudi Aramco, right? The product of the Iranian government. So interesting. Dark Seoul out of North Korea. Sands Casino out of Iran again. This one was a really interesting one. Sony Pictures, again, by North Korea, on November 24th, 2014. I mean, my goodness, the possibility for evildoing is just infinite. They gave us example. I mean, certainly it's not an election example, but for example, any foreign actor, for example, could hack in, say, to a military database and change all the blood types. I mean, that would really throw our defense forces for a loop, heaven forbid, if something should happen. But my point again was just that, these are things which were not evaluated perhaps effectively within 76, despite all of our amendments and our force into amendments. And it really is incredible, like how quickly something like that could happen. So so we had that there. So I mean, when we evaluate 76, in addition to this debate commission, it just unfortunately makes us really start to question the objective the objective of objectives, I guess, of this government and these actions. I mean, we the people, we've heard that throughout time. For the people, that's something we've heard a lot more lately. But what do people really think when they hear we the people or for the people? And even for the people, how did people think about that phrase a year ago comparative to now? I argue it has a really different context now from a year ago and now. So my point is that we can, an entity can say, a government can say, well, we're really doing this for Canadians. But the only way to truly know that is to evaluate the actions and then make the determination if this is truly what is happening. But if we evaluate policies and proposals and actions and we see that they're not actually serving the people, that they are serving the entity, in this case the government itself, then unfortunately it's hard for us to have confidence, and that's even all the more reason we should have this review. And I'm sure the government would welcome the opportunity to have these tests of democracy checked and challenged, because if they truly felt confident in their capacity as democratic instruments, then they would not hesitate at all in an effort to have them sort of put to each of their own individual tests. And as well, I dare say it's very rich. Some of the stuff you read in the media in terms of the accusations that fly around in regards to third parties, or when in fact we, the Conservatives, put forward amendments which would have eliminated the possibility of many of these problems, and they were rejected time after time after time. In fact, 194 times, to be precise. 194, that's a pretty big number, I have to say. So, we've got the Bill C-76. Then we have this debate commission with the uncertain processes to candidate, not having gone through the House. Again, not trying hard to prove as independent, questioning of the journalists, who have come forth sort of opposing it, and then yesterday, lo and behold, what do we see again in the fall economic statement but this announcement of $595 million for the media. I mean, and this is really crazy stuff, seeing this type of money put towards what is supposed to be an independent media. But actually, now that I evaluate that, I really don't know what $595 gets you in terms of production value. Facebook, I mean, gosh,
Ms. Christie, you try and stay more on the
Thank you.
Motion?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, I guess I'm just talking of the reasons of the necessity for the review, which are many, as I'm sort of determining more and more. But yes, this $595 million. I mean, it's very concerning in terms of the independent media. I mean, I struggle to think, well, I don't understand yet, and maybe it wasn't clear in the fall economic statement, and I'll have to follow up further in terms of the actual distribution and the funding tied to that. But, certainly this must relate back to the debate commissioner in some way or in some capacity, because I would imagine that some of this $595 million goes to members of the advisory commission who would be on this debate commission. And would they be compromised? I mean, that's a fair question. That's a really fair question as we consider this $595 million that was announced yesterday for media. I mean, it's kind of the same, independent commission, independent media. And you know what? I look forward to. I don't know what they're saying, but I'd be curious to hear the the comments of the journalists in response to this. They must actually be quite torn in terms of sort of having a sense of capital, but then also with the strings that are attached, because there are always strings attached, it would seem. So, maybe, again, these individuals who commented on the debate commission, Marie Vastel, Chantal Hébert, Andrew Coyne, Christelle Kobe-Cash, I would look to them to see if they will have articles on this media funding as well. But then again, they might stay silent, right? Because this is a conflict too that occurs when you are given money. It's hard to speak poor of someone that is giving you something. So they must in fact feel very, very conflicted, but as I said, it does affect the debate commission, because potentially they could serve as members of this advisory group, and again, could they be compromised? Like if we knew, for example, one of their members, if their salary was directly paid by this $595 million from the federal government, could we say that they are truly independent in terms of advisement and of the rules? Probably not. And I guess it also brings the question in regards to the debate commission. We talk about that, they will be free. Well, we might argue we just paid $595 million for these debates, so maybe they weren't free. I've been pretty good at math historically. That's close to $300 million a debate. That's not a cheap debate. That's a lot of money for a debate. Definitely, if we were to think of it in those terms. But again, certainly the reason that we need to review this announcement. So because for all of these reasons, which I've indicated, and I was also I was thinking earlier about the mandate of the people, and the minister did speak quite extensively in regards to the research that was done. She talked about online, she talked about cross-country consultations from coast to coast, and that yes, that is comforting. I've never actually read the summary of the consultation, and I guess I'm wondering if it was as well received and implemented, or integrated maybe is a better word, as was our
point of order.
Point of order, Mr. Nader.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I was just, I don't want to interrupt my colleague too long. I'm just wondering if it's, you know what? I'm good, thanks, Chair. I was just clearing my throat. I think good. Thanks.
So you're good to go on like this till 1 o'clock? Okay.
Carry on.
Okay. So what was I talking about? Oh yes, the math of the two. Yeah, so that's right. So that's right. The will of the Canadians. So, it sounds like they did their due diligence, and at least from what we heard this morning in terms of consultation, I just hope that the Canadian public was paid more respect than we were in regards to being completely left out of the nomination process. But you know what, Chair? I might be wrapping up here. I feel I had a lot to express today, and it is the Grey Cup this weekend. I'm pretty excited with the Calgary Stampeders in it.
Here.
Yeah. But
Not because of this.
with that, I'm just saying I just want to be part of the solution. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Ms. Cusi. Now we'll go on to Mr. Nader. Just to let you know, we have 3 people on the list. So if you want,
Thank you.
you don't want to complete this process, We will. We won't.
I have 3 points, Chair.
Sure.
I just want to make 3 points. First of all, one government never stays in power forever. I think that's a given fact. We've enjoyed the wins and we've enjoyed the defeats of forming government and losing government, as all parties do. Mr. Christopher has experience provincially on that end, but it always begs the question, what about the next appointment? And I don't think anyone has any qualms about David Johnston, exceptional human being, exceptional Canadian. But what about next time? Will the Liberals appoint Madeleine Meilleur next time, as they try to do with the official language commissioner? That's a legitimate question. You know, if the Conservatives were in office, would the opposition have a concern with us appointing someone to fill that position unilaterally? And I think that's a concern. You know, were we to appoint, Stockwell Day as the debates commissioner, there might be some concerns around the table outside of our party. But that's the challenge and the concerns we have when one party, one person appoints a position, regardless of how exceptional that person is. And that's why this isn't about the person, it's about the process, which is why I think this motion is worthwhile. Second point I want to make is about the Order in Council appointment. It's a concerning concept from the independent side of things. I want to read very briefly from an Order in Council appointment on a different subject. It says, pursuant to paragraph 127.11c of the Public Service Employment Act, appoints the name J. Allen Shaw, Bloomfield, Prince Edward Island, to be a special advisor to the Prime Minister to serve on an ad hoc provincial member of the Independent Advisory Board for Senate appointments. I have not yet seen the Order in Council appointing Mr. Johnston as a debates commissioner, but under all enabling legislation, the only way he can be done so through an Order of Council is as a special advisor to the Prime Minister. That's concerning. I do not want to see this tarnished by such a way in which what ought to be and what must be based on this process is done as a special advisor to the Prime Minister, despite the words of protestation to the contrary. That's effectively what will happen. The third point is,
Discuss that with the minister?
I raised the point with her, but I didn't get a clear answer on that. But that's based on the Public Service Employment Act. That would be the only logical way that one could be appointed to a position that doesn't exist by legislative means. A third and final point, and it's based on the motion itself, is the timing of this report. It says in a timely fashion. We have 6 meetings remaining before Christmas. I think all of us would like to see this report done in a timely fashion, and to put words to timely fashion, let's get this done before Christmas. I have no reason to expect that we can't do that. If we wanted to gum up this committee, we could gum up this committee. We're not doing that. We want to have a short, timely report on this matter. It can be tabled before Christmas. Mr. Christopherson has joked before it takes him 4 hours to clear his throat. We're not doing that. We want to hear 20 minutes. We want to have this report done quick, analyze this, and have the opportunity to have meaningful input, meaningful review of this process. That hasn't happened. So I'll leave it there, Chair, and thank you for your indulgence.
Okay, I have 2 people on the list, Ruby and Mr. Christopherson. Did you want to go first, or do you want Mr. Christopherson?
Mr. Christopherson could go first.
Yeah, thank you, Ruby. Thank you, Chair. I'll be very brief because this is not a filibuster with no intent to try to do that. And I want to say that, and I hope colleagues will appreciate that my remarks are made far more in sorrow than in anger. I'm just so heartbroken that something so important has, as Mr. Nader has just described, has been tarnished. And that's a shame, and it needn't be. And, again, the Democratic Reform Ministry has become the file from hell. I mean, this was one of the signature pieces for this government, and this is the file, one of them, where they have failed the most spectacularly and unfortunately in ways that are important. And that's where the sorrow comes from. This didn't need to be. I've indicated to the government, I've made no bones about it, I've indicated to the minister my willingness, my caucus's willingness to do major reform, especially to undo the damage that the previous government did with C-23. We gave them every political opportunity. Most governments would be drooling at what they were offered in terms of the political coverage of having 2 of the 3 parties on democratic reform. It used to be it had to be unanimous. We seem to have lost that. And the best best we can get right now is at least a majority of recognized parties in the House, and I know Ms. May doesn't like that, but that's how we work things, that at least a majority, 2 out of 3 of the parties. And I've consistently offered that to the government to let them know that if they do the right thing, they're going to have the political support from the NDP to give them the legitimacy to make the changes, expecting that the authors of the changes in C-23 might be defending them going forward, which they have done. But if I can, parenthetically, and we're starting to get close to going, I just want to thank the government members on this file, or the previous government members on this file. They could have easily made every single change a hill to die on politically and justified it to their base. And I just want to say they didn't do that, and where some of us were taking shots at them, deserve it in my opinion, obviously. You know, for the most part, they just absorbed the hit because there was a decision made by the Canadian people in the last election that there were some things they didn't like, and I like to think that some of those anti-democratic moves were part of it. And I just want to say that I've been impressed with kind of the grown-up approach that the Conservative members, when we're dealing with some of their legacy pieces, the way they've conducted themselves. It's been very classy and very helpful, and Canadians need to know that. I'll just end by saying my motion is not a gotcha by any stretch, and that's why I worded it the way I did. You can see there's no traps in there. Very sincerely, Chair, I think certainly my motivation, and I'm hearing from the Conservatives, it's their approach too. And again, you know, I give them their due. They didn't vote for the package. And yet, when we were working on it, they still participated in a lot of areas to help us make that report as strong as we could. So again, the Conservative colleagues on this file, given the history, have been very productive, and it's worth noting, and I want to thank them for that. And so the purpose of the motion is to try to add some legitimacy, because I don't know where this is going to end up. I don't know if there's going to be a party that balks on participating and claiming the lack of legitimacy as their reason, in which case, thank you, Liberals. You completely screwed up on an important file. And it didn't need to be. That's what really gets me. It's the mismanagement of this file, of this ministry, that has been so, and it's not, I have to say, I don't believe it's the fault of the 2 ministers that have been in those positions. Those decisions were made from on high. That's pretty clear. And it's also clear how bad those decisions were and how bad those directions were. So, in an attempt, sincerely, Chair, to give some legitimacy, to make it more difficult for anybody to wiggle out of participating, let's at least try to add some legitimacy from this committee onto this process, because the government has no legitimacy. And therefore, by extension, the Commission, at least, and again to use Mr. Nader's word, is tarnished. That's not a good way to start your election. And it didn't need to be. So, let's us, since we didn't make these decisions, and we know this issue, and we've already worked through it, let's us take ownership again and do the best we can to give some legitimacy to this important component of our precious election system. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Christopherson. Very eloquent, as always. And the last speaker on this motion is Ms. Ruby. Ms. Sahota, sorry.
Yeah, that's fine. I guess just take a quick minute and just say that hopefully we can move forward and vote on this motion that we've been debating. I had something that I was really wanting to say earlier, but now I think I'm rethinking a little bit of it, but I think we do just need to move forward. We all do recognize that the person who is potentially going to be the commissioner is highly qualified, and in the sake of consensus, sometimes there's a lot of games played as well, and we never get somebody in place. all other commissioners and people appointed by government are highly scrutinized by Parliament, and we've seen that in the past when bad decisions are made. They are, brought forward in Parliament, and the government of the time is shamed for making a bad decision for an appointment, one that would be seen as inappropriate or biased or, whatnot. And I think that will continue to happen going forward, and the criteria that's been set in place has been done so in a way that the broadest, the most amount of parties could be able to participate, those that would have some shot at forming government or electing a lot of members. So I think it's in the best interest of our democracy to make sure that we have steady debates going forward, and therefore I think we should vote on this motion and move forward.
Okay, ready for the vote? A recorded vote, please. Mr. Clerk.
Monsieur Iacono.
La motion?
On vote sur la motion?
Non. C'est non?
Oui.
Non.
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 Monsieur Graham?
No.
Madame Lapointe?
No.
Ms. Sahota?
No.
Mr. Sims?
No.
Ms. Kuzi?
Wait.
Mr. Nader?
Yes.
Mr. Reid?
Excuse me. Yeah, yes.
Mr. Christopherson?
Wait.
Okay, the motion is defeated. And on Tuesday.
Alors, la motion est rejetée et mardi, nous reviendrons à là où nous étions, portant donc sur la motion de privilège. Merci à tous et à toutes.